From the beginning of human civilization leading to the present day, humans have found themselves engaged in conflict based on mere differences and the thirst for expansion. Wars found themselves manifesting in separate regions with little effects to the outer regions. But wars such as the 100 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars reshaped the intensity and outreach of conflict by expanding altercation to a continental and global scale. It is the roaring 20s and the American industry is booming from the profits of foreign war. Women are starting to express themselves and break from the social norm. African Americans are starting to find leadership with promise towards the goal of civil rights, and white people are thriving off the exploitation of minorities. The quality of life in America for whites was high. Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover were rolling back government regulations, and it felt as if nothing could go wrong. October 29, 1929. The stock market had just crashed and was the first step to the destabilization of the world economy and a cause of the following Great Depression. The Great Depression affected the whole world and led to the rise of new ideologies such as fascism in Germany, Italy, and Spain, and communism in the Soviet Union. These conflicting ideals and their actions eventually led to World War II between the Axis and Allied powers. This war created a tremendous amount of toil upon the infrastructure and population of the European countries involved, but left the US on top of the world and externally unscathed. The war ended in an Allied victory and ultimately ended the Great Depression with it. World War II left the world with only two major superpowers, the US and the USSR, thus placing the world in a Cold War. The hypothetical war of communism against capitalism raged on in the hearts of the world population, as sides had to be taken in order to lessen punishment. The US found itself in a strong conformist state where anything different was thought to be anti-capitalist. This conformist movement was met by gender equality, civil rights, and other anti-conformist movements within the US, and challenged the stability of the country. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, the effects on the home front during World War II and the Cold War were similar in that they both faced refugee crises and they both encountered anti-conformity sentiments. However, they were different in their development of youth culture and the progression of gender equality. The home front during World War II and the Cold War experienced an influx of refugees who were seeking asylum in America. During World War II, America inherited many Polish, French, Dutch, Belgian, Austrian, and Czech refugees because of America's semi-isolated geographical position. Many of these refugees identified with the Jewish faith and were fleeing their home countries from the extreme intolerance of Jews by Nazi Germany. Jewish refugees were met with lesser forms of intolerance in America and were heavily A poster created by an anti-communist organization says, "Out with Jews, let white people run this country as they did before the Jewish invasion." The American people needed to find a scapegoat to blame for the downfall of their economy, and they found exactly that in the most vulnerable people. Americans did not consider freedom as a right anymore, but as a privilege for white Christians. The home front during the Cold War faced similar refugee crises due to the two major proxy wars, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. The entirety of these two countries became a war zone and caused many families to seek refuge in America. The American people met these asylum seekers with distrust and fear as they had come from communist countries in the midst of the Second Red Scare. Americans still had the idea that Asian people were bad as a consequence of the Japanese during World War II and the Chinese Communist Revolution. Koreans and Vietnamese were often viewed as low-class citizens and could only find work in menial tasks in agriculture. These refugee crises followed the same patterns a decade apart and exposed the continuation of instability in the home front. During the 1940s and 1950s, the home front saw many movements that tried to break the social norms and change the American society. The 1940s retained the echo of the voices of civil rights leaders such as Webb Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and Marcus Garvey, as the NAACP grew stronger and lynching rates were decreasing. African Americans were allowed to join the military, and they were starting to find a solid foundation to build their movement towards civil rights off of. Even though the military was segregated, most African Americans saw their ability to join the military as a step forward, and is described by Walter White, the NAACP secretary in 1942. "In the pursuit of this task, the colored people of America will do their share. Howard University has set for them an example which will inspire them in the performance of this duty, and the diffusion of higher training and education among the Negroes of America is aiding them." This mobilization of African Americans was not only in the military but also in the social sphere, as the Double V campaign came to life, calling for victory in Europe and victory in America. Walter White explains, "We cannot lose sight of the kind of world that will remain for mankind when this struggle has concluded. While we are fighting to preserve everything we have gained in economic, political, and religious freedom, we must struggle in the world that mankind must inherit to enlarge the enjoyment of these privileges." This movement can be paralleled to the distaste of suburban society by non-whites in the 1950s. The suburbs had become a breeding ground for racism, sexism, and conformity as white people created segregated neighborhoods in order to reduce the influence of communism, non-white culture, and other undesired institutions. Anti-conformists started to campaign around this idea of toxicity revolving around the cookie-cutter neighborhoods in the suburbs. Malvina Reynolds sings in her song Little Boxes.
And the people in the houses all went to the university where they were put in boxes and they came out all the same. And there's doctors and lawyers.
Reynolds mocks the monotony and the resemblance of each neighborhood and how all the people living in these neighborhoods all grew up the same way in the same houses. Suburbia was seen as a pure example of white privilege to minorities, and they strayed away from the conformity of these neighborhoods in order to develop a nonconformist culture. These nonconformist sentiments were a result of World War II and the Cold War's effect on the people at home and how they developed their desires around the situation of the country. While the 1940s saw little expansion and development of youth culture, the 1950s experienced a massive growth in the Youth Rebellion and featured a distinct youth culture as a result of World War II and the Cold War. With the war effort for World War II raging on in the US, the youth of America was focused on doing their part as boys suited up to join the military and girls started to work in factories. The youth of America was occupied with the war, therefore no substantial development of a youth. During the 1950s, however, the youth of America was thriving as they strayed from the guidance of their parents and rebelled against their judgment. In the movie clip from Rebel Without a Cause, Jim can be seen yelling at his parents and criticizing them. Before the Youth Rebellion, this would have been seen as a great act of disrespect toward his parents. The youth of America was starting to find their own culture through music and beat poetry. Elvis Presley played a major role in igniting this rebellion through his new form of music that reached the white youth community. While the youth of World War II era was unable to find their own voice, the youth during the Cold War found a way to express themselves through media, music, and writing. The equality of genders experienced a major boom during the World War II era, however the Cold War stalemated in that category of progress. The war effort of World War II and the need for the mass production of goods led to the enabling of women to receive jobs in arms factories. It was not only white women, but colored women as well. Walter White, secretary of the NAACP in 1942, explains, "We rejoice that the men and women who constitute the colored portion of our population in America place themselves and are placing themselves at the service of their government." Women were finally given their chance to contribute to the well-being of the country, and they did exactly that. Women started to gain more of a role in society due to the presence of individual income and the heavy propaganda movement that symbolized the power of women and eradicated thoughts of inferiority. As World War II came to a conclusion and the Cold War was in full effect, women found themselves losing their recently gained higher roles in society and thus succumbing to men once again. Men were able to return to their jobs, and women lost most of their factory jobs to immigrants, refugees, and men returning from the war. In the June 5, 1956 edition of the Milton Berle Show, Berle mutters jokingly,
"I'm telling you, I got a good mind to take you and walk you out in the alley.
Milton, I'm a girl.
Shows you I got a good mind. Now,
insinuating that he's going to beat her out back. The show also portrays the woman in the show as a ditzy and dumb girl in a pretty dress. This shows us that society at the time was numb to the immorality of abuse and is seen laughing off Berle's joke about abusing the woman on the stage. Women had again become exiled to the private sector of life as they were only allowed to cook, clean, and raise the kids in the household. While women's equality to men took a great leap forward in the 1940s due to World War II, the 1950s exhibited a major setback and detraction of the roles and rights of women in society. In conclusion, the Cold War and World War II caused many of the same changes on the home front, but also presented different changes as well. Anti-conformist groups rose up and refugees flooded the streets of major cities during both war eras, although gender equality pulled closer as the youth remained quiet during World War II and the complete opposite happened during the Cold War. The home front was an ever-changing place during the wars and would continue to change as the Cold War fulminated.